In the summer of 1832, a perfectly healthy New York carpenter went to sleep and was dead before morning. That wasn't unusual. That was just summer in a rapidly growing 19th century city. At least that's what everyone thought. How did the very water meant to keep a city alive become the exact microscopic thing that was killing it? How does a society go from dying by the thousands to trusting a modern indoor faucet without a second thought? It starts with something as simple as a neighborhood pump and a deadly microscopic threat hiding quietly in plain sight. Before massive reservoirs and pressurized underground pipes, getting fresh water in an American city meant relying on what was beneath your feet. In crowded places like Boston and Philadelphia, almost every household relied heavily on a shallow backyard well or a public street pump. If you were a homemaker in the 1820s, hauling water was a grueling, back-breaking daily chore that defined your life. A typical family needed roughly 20 to 30 gallons a day just for cooking, drinking, and maintaining basic household washing. Every single drop had to be lifted by hand, carried in heavy wooden buckets, and hauled carefully inside the home. You would walk to the corner pump, wait in a long line, and lug the dead weight back to your cramped kitchen. It was exhausting. The physical labor consumed hours of daylight and left women with constantly aching shoulders and heavy hands. For those living in the new brick tenements, it meant carrying sloshing buckets up multiple flights of dark, narrow stairs. Clean water was incredibly heavy, remarkably precious, and used sparingly. You didn't waste a single drop if you didn't have to. Hot bathing was a rare luxury, and laundry day was an absolute ordeal of boiling water and scrubbing over a washboard. However, the physical labor of hauling it wasn't the real danger lurking at the bottom of those wooden pails. As American cities expanded rapidly, urban populations doubled and tripled in the short span of a single bustling generation. Hundreds of thousands of people were suddenly living shoulder to shoulder, and the basic civic infrastructure simply couldn't keep up. This is where the story takes a sudden turn nobody sees coming, leading to a catastrophe hidden underground. With more people packed together came more human waste, and there was absolutely no underground sewer system to carry it safely away. Instead, all household waste went directly into privy vaults and deep cesspools dug right into the backyards of these crowded neighborhoods. Picture the typical layout of a narrow city lot in 1840, packed with families striving to make a new living. At one end of the dirt yard, you had the family well drawing up fresh groundwater for the day's drinking and cooking. Just a few yards away, you had the communal cesspool, slowly filling with human waste from dozens of tenement residents. The earth between them was highly porous, and as the vaults inevitably overflowed, the barrier between clean and dirty vanished. Dark, contaminated liquids slowly seeped through the loose soil, quietly mingling with the precious drinking water floating just below the surface. People would permanently pump water that looked visibly cloudy, had a slight yellow tint, or smelled oddly metallic and foul. Yet they drank it anyway, because there was simply no other source available to them in the heat of the summer. Thirst always wins. It doesn't matter how questionable or dangerous the cup of water might look to the human eye. Many families boiled the water to make a pot of tea, inadvertently saving their own lives without understanding the microbiology. Others drank it straight from the dipper, completely unaware they were swallowing an invisible poison drawn right from their own yard. The rapidly growing cities had accidentally engineered the perfect delivery system for a mass casualty event on a staggering scale. That was only round one in the deadly battle against the microscopic killers hiding beneath the cobblestone streets. Because urban water was so notoriously unreliable and foul-tasting, many people simply chose not to drink it at all if they could. For generations, the safest beverage in an American working-class home wasn't water from the well. It was cheap, abundant alcohol. Hard cider, weak, small beer, and fermented drinks were consumed daily by laboring men, women, and even very young children. The natural fermentation process and the boiling of the brewer's wort effectively killed the dangerous pathogens hiding in the water supply. Without knowing anything about germ theory, Society had developed a survival habit based entirely on basic observation and trial and error. People noticed that those who drank beer stayed relatively healthy, while those who drank from the corner pump often fell violently ill. In the early 19th century, Americans were drinking roughly 3 times as much alcohol per capita as they do today. It wasn't just about widespread intoxication. It was a fundamental public health strategy disguised as a standard cultural habit. Alcohol couldn't wash filthy clothes, it couldn't cook a warm stew, and it couldn't sustain a rapidly industrializing urban workforce forever. The working poor in the tenements couldn't afford a steady supply of ale for their incredibly large and growing families. They were forced to rely on the public street pumps, rolling the dice with every single bucket they hauled back home. And then, a new terror arrived on merchant ships from across the ocean, looking for the absolute perfect breeding ground. Cholera struck North America in 1832 with a sudden, devastating ferocity that terrified everyone from the mayor to the laborer. It wasn't a slow, lingering illness. A perfectly healthy person could be walking down the street at noon and be dead by midnight. The symptoms were horrific: violent, rapid dehydration, a sudden physical collapse, and the victim's skin turning a ghastly shade of blue. In New York City alone, thousands perished in a matter of weeks, their bodies quietly carried away on wooden death carts. Wealthy residents fled to the countryside in a sheer panic, abandoning their stately homes to escape the invisible, terrifying slaughter. The working poor, trapped in the sweltering tenements with the contaminated pumps, bore the absolute brunt of the relentless nightmare. Urban graveyards overflowed with the dead, and entire families were wiped out in the span of a single, agonizing summer weekend. Fear gripped the young nation. Cities held public days of fasting, praying desperately for deliverance from the sudden, inexplicable plague. Desperate citizens burned barrels of foul tar in the streets, hoping the thick, black smoke would somehow purify the surrounding environment. The death toll kept rising steadily, and nobody could figure out how the disease was moving so fast from house to house. The most brilliant medical minds of the era were fundamentally and disastrously wrong about what was causing the widespread devastation. They searched the skies and the wind for clues, while the true killer flowed quietly beneath their leather boots. They were blind. The prevailing miasma theory kept an entire generation of doctors from seeing the microscopic reality in their cups. Solving one problem quietly created a far stranger one, as the medical establishment doubled down on their mistaken beliefs. For centuries, the global medical establishment firmly believed in the miasma theory as the root cause of all major epidemics. They were convinced that terrible diseases were caused by bad air or foul smells rising naturally from rotting organic matter. If a poor neighborhood smelled like open sewage and people were dying there, the miasma theory seemed perfectly, logically sound. Doctors urgently advised people to close their windows, avoid the damp night air, and carry sweet-smelling herbs to ward off sickness. They ignored the drinking water entirely because the idea of microscopic killers spreading through a well was considered absolute nonsense. Even when patients loudly complained about the murky, foul-tasting water from the local street pump, health boards quickly dismissed it. They blamed the victims instead, pointing fingers at their cheap diet, their morals, or their crowded, unhygienic living conditions. A prominent physician even declared that cholera only struck those who ate raw green vegetables or drank too much cold water. As long as the experts chased bad smells in the wind, the real killer continued to flow freely from every spout. The deep tragedy of the miasma theory was that it blinded science to the terrifying truth right in front of them. Hundreds of thousands died globally, while educated doctors furiously debated the specific quality of the urban air in the slums. Across the Atlantic, one stubborn man was about to challenge the establishment and change the course of medical history forever. He looked at the bodies. He didn't look at the sky to find the killer, but directly at the tragic geography. That sounds like progress. It was, but the heavy cost was paid in human lives before anyone would finally listen. In 1854, London experienced a cholera outbreak so fierce and concentrated It shocked the entire civilized medical world. In the crowded Soho district, over 500 people died in just 10 days, an unprecedented concentration of sudden mortality. An English physician named John Snow lived nearby, and he strongly doubted the prevailing miasma theory that everyone else accepted. Snow suspected the water, but to prove it to a stubborn medical board, he needed hard, undeniable mathematical evidence. Snow went door to door, interviewing grieving families, asking one specific question nobody else in the medical field cared about. He asked the surviving relatives exactly where they went to get their daily supply of drinking water before the sickness hit. The answers all pointed like an arrow to one very specific location: a popular public well on Broad Street. Snow took a street map of the neighborhood and marked every single recorded death with a small, stark black bar. The visual evidence was staggering. The black marks clustered intensely and undeniably around that one specific public water source. It was a masterpiece of early data visualization, proving visually that the invisible killer was coming from the ground itself. He even found that workers at a nearby brewery who drank only beer had entirely escaped the deadly illness sweeping the block. Knowing the truth and getting powerful people to believe it were two entirely different battles in the rigid 19th century. They fought back. The medical establishment wasn't going to surrender their cherished theories easily, just because one doctor drew lines. This brings us to a moment of quiet rebellion that would ultimately save millions of lives across the globe. Snow took his map and his meticulous, terrifying findings to the local parish board of guardians in charge of the district. He presented the case that the popular Broad Street pump was actively poisoning the entire neighborhood with every single bucket drawn. The board was highly skeptical. The water from that specific pump looked clear and tasted surprisingly sweet and refreshing to them. The sheer weight of Snow's grim tally, however, was mathematically impossible for them to completely ignore or brush aside. In a hesitant, reluctant move, they agreed to a simple mechanical intervention just to see if it would make a difference. They took the handle. They removed the iron lever from the Broad Street pump, making it impossible for anyone to draw water. It was a quiet, unceremonious act, but it effectively shut off the primary source of the deadly contamination in the neighborhood. Almost immediately, the terrifying cholera outbreak in Soho began to dramatically subside, proving Snow's radical theory was correct all along. Later investigations revealed a leaking cesspool was seeping directly into the well just 3 feet away through the ruined brickwork. The sweet taste of the water was due to the high concentration of nitrates from human waste filtering into the supply. Snow had proved that water carried the disease, fundamentally breaking the miasma theory's iron grip on the medical establishment. It would take years for American cities to fully accept the terrifying reality of what they were drinking every single day. They couldn't just remove handles from pumps. They needed to find entirely new, massive rivers to sustain their booming populations. And the engineering coping strategies only got more extreme as the desperate search for clean water moved further outside the cities. News of Snow's map slowly crossed the Atlantic, but American civil engineers were already getting desperate to solve the water crisis. Even before germ theory was fully accepted, city leaders knew they had to find vast water sources far outside the city limits. The local urban wells were visibly failing, smelling heavily of sulfur and turning brackish as the population density exploded. New York City took a massive financial gamble and built the Croton Aqueduct, a stunning marvel of 19th century engineering. They piped fresh, pristine water from a river 40 miles away, bypassing the contaminated local groundwater of Manhattan entirely. When the first clean water flowed from the fountains in 1842, people literally celebrated in the streets with parades. For the first time, working-class families had access to abundant water that didn't risk killing them with every single sip. Chicago faced a different nightmare. They were dumping raw sewage into the exact same massive lake they drank their water from. Their ultimate solution was brilliantly insane. They engineered a way to permanently reverse the flow of the Chicago River. By dredging and engineering, they forced the sewage away from the lake, saving the city's primary drinking supply from certain ruin. These massive projects proved that clean water was no longer an individual household burden, but a critical, life-saving civic duty. Moving water wasn't enough to stop the microscopic killers completely, as outbreaks still flared up in the sprawling new systems. The final battle for public health wasn't fought with bricks, aqueducts, and massive iron pipes laid beneath the avenues. It was fought with chemistry. The final battle happened inside a quiet laboratory, using a weapon that frightened the paranoid public. By the late 19th century, the scientific world finally embraced germ theory and accepted that microscopic bacteria were the real enemy. They realized that securing a clean source wasn't enough. The water itself had to be continuously treated before reaching the home. Cities began building massive sand filtration plants, forcing river water through deep layers of earth to physically trap the deadly bacteria. It was a massive improvement, drastically dropping the terrifying rates of cholera and typhoid across the rapidly industrializing country. The ultimate victory came quietly in the early 1900s, with the introduction of a highly controversial and pungent chemical. In 1908, Jersey City became the first in America to chlorinate its municipal water supply under Dr. John Leo. People were terrified at first, fearing the harsh chemical would poison their families faster than the disease ever did. The results were undeniable. Chlorination acted as an invisible shield, wiping out waterborne pathogens instantly before they ever reached the tap. Typhoid death rates plummeted so fast it looked like a literal mathematical error on the public health statistical charts. The deadly trap of the American city had finally been disarmed once and for all by a few drops of chlorine. Millions of lives were saved by a silent process we now entirely take for granted every time we turn a faucet. The dark days of hauling heavy wooden buckets from contaminated street wells faded rapidly into the forgotten pages of history. The shadow of those early days still lingers beneath our modern streets, hidden inside the vast network of iron and steel. Which brings us exactly to why this hidden history matters so much to how we live in our homes today. Tracing one cholera outbreak to a single pump in London didn't just solve a local medical mystery for a desperate neighborhood. It essentially forced the invention of modern public health and built the invisible urban infrastructure we rely on to survive today. Without that map, American cities would have remained stagnant, deadly traps, utterly unable to grow into the metropolises we know. The pressurized pipes running beneath your feet are a silent monument to the thousands who died just trying to quench their thirst. Think back to that New York carpenter in 1832, struck down in the middle of the night by a fever. He didn't know the murky water he carried home to his family in a wooden pail was his own silent executioner. Today, we walk to a gleaming tap, turn a metal handle, and drink deeply without a second thought or a prayer. We trust the system. We rely on the invisible, massive infrastructure entirely, never once doubting the clear, safe liquid that flows. The technology changed dramatically. The essential human need for clean, fresh water didn't change a single bit over the centuries. The fear is gone. It has been replaced by a quiet confidence in the civil engineering that keeps the modern world turning. The only difference is that we forgot what it felt like to be mortally afraid of a single drop of water. We solved the deadly problem so completely that we forgot it was ever a problem for our ancestors at all. The comfort is wonderfully new. The absolute forgetting of the past is newer still, a luxury bought with immense suffering. That was the hidden price of urban survival, and the heavy cost was paid in human history and lost generations. We turn the handle, the water flows, and we are safe, shielded by a century of invisible, life-saving engineering. If this deep dive into the past is keeping you hooked, hit subscribe. We uncover hidden history like this every single week. Leave a comment below if you've ever taken a clean, safe glass of tap water completely for granted in your life. Take a quick second to like the video. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who love bizarre, historical facts. See you in the next episode, where we dig up another strange and fascinating secret from the hidden pages of history.